September 22nd, 1944. The forest was unnervingly still, the air thick with the weight of impending violence. A low growl vibrated through the earth, slowly building, until it broke the silence. The M18 Hellcat's engine roared to life, a sound that sent shivers through the nearby German soldiers, who had, until then, believed themselves safe behind their imposing Panzer tanks. The Germans were accustomed to their heavy machinery, but nothing could prepare them for the speed, the sheer ferocity of the Hellcat. In the heart of northern France, deep in the thick, treacherous woods, the scene was set for a clash of two contrasting forces. The Allies had long relied on their tactical speed, but it was this particular moment that would reveal the true power of their armored tank destroyers. The German forces had settled into what they believed was an unshakable defense. Their Panzers, massive and powerful, were poised to strike, but they had never encountered a tank like this before. Inside the Hellcat, Sergeant William "Bill" Barnes leaned forward in his seat, his face drawn tight with focus. Sweat trickled down his brow, stinging his eyes. It was the summer of 1944. The war had been raging across Europe for years, but now the fight was intensifying. The Allies were advancing on every front, pushing the Germans back with relentless force. Bill was a veteran, having fought in countless battles, but today was different. Today, they weren't just fighting for survival. Today, they would make history. The Hellcat, nicknamed for its speed and power, was unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. Designed to be fast and light, it wasn't a conventional tank. It was a tank destroyer. Armed with a 76mm gun, its mission was clear: to seek out and destroy the enemy's heavy armor. But it wasn't just the gun that made the Hellcat deadly. It was its agility, its ability to maneuver through rough terrain with a speed that left the Panzers in the dust. Bill had been briefed just hours earlier. They were part of a smaller division tasked with infiltrating the German lines in the dense woods, moving fast, striking hard, and then disappearing before the enemy could react. The Germans had long been proud of their superior firepower, their invincible Panzers. They never expected a light, fast-moving tank to disrupt their plans. As Bill surveyed the dense forest through the periscope, his hands tightened around the turret's controls. The air was thick with tension. His crew, a mix of seasoned soldiers, sat in silence, each one awaiting their orders, knowing that one misstep could be their last. But there was something different in the air today, a palpable sense of excitement, of anticipation. The Hellcat was about to prove its worth. The distant sound of enemy Panzers could be heard, their engines growling as they moved into position. Bill's heart raced, but he remained calm. They had trained for this moment, prepared for the chaos that was about to unfold. The Hellcat, with its impressive speed and firepower, was built for moments like these. The German tanks, on the other hand, were slow and methodical. Heavy, lumbering giants that relied on brute force. They were not designed for quick maneuvers, for swift strikes. They had the power, but the Hellcat had the speed. "Ready, Sergeant," called out Corporal Myers from the back of the vehicle, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of nerves. He manned the secondary gun, prepared to lay down suppressing fire if needed. Bill nodded sharply. "Keep your eyes peeled, Myers. We'll hit them hard and we'll hit them fast." A few moments passed in silence, each one stretching out, filled with the quiet tension of soldiers waiting for the storm to break. The Germans were just a few hundred meters away now, barely visible through the thick underbrush, their massive tanks moving into position with slow, deliberate care. They were confident. They didn't believe they were in danger. Then the first shot rang out. It wasn't from the Hellcat. A German artillery shell exploded nearby, sending debris flying and rocking the ground beneath them. But Bill had already seen the flash from the German tanks. They had spotted their target, and now the battle was on. The quiet of the forest was shattered by the sounds of war, the roar of engines, the blasts of artillery, and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. "Now!" Bill shouted, and the Hellcat surged forward with terrifying speed, its engine howling as it tore through the trees. The German tanks, caught off guard by the sudden movement, scrambled to turn their guns, but the Hellcat was already out of range. Another blast rang out, and the first German tank exploded, its turret flying off in a spectacular display of destruction. Bill's pulse quickened. The enemy was in chaos. They had expected a slow, methodical advance, but instead they had been struck by a tank they couldn't even see. The Hellcat was a predator in the woods, swift and unseen. It was designed to strike quickly and then vanish, leaving the Germans confused, disoriented, and vulnerable. But even as they surged forward, Bill knew they couldn't keep this pace forever. The Germans would adapt, and when they did, the real fight would begin. There was no time to waste. They had to keep moving. Every second counted. With a swift motion, Bill barked orders to his crew, and the Hellcat zigzagged through the trees, its engines roaring like a beast on the hunt. The tension in the air was thick now. The Germans had seen the Hellcat's deadly speed, and they were beginning to react. The Panzers were beginning to close in, but the Hellcats were always a step ahead, darting from cover to cover, picking off targets one by one. Bill glanced over at his crew, his face hard with concentration. The moment of reckoning was drawing near. The battle was just beginning, and the Hellcat had shown the Germans one thing they would never forget: speed, precision, and the ability to outmaneuver their massive Panzers. As the Hellcat tore deeper into the forest, Bill's grip tightened on the controls. The enemy was closing in. It was now or never. The real test of the Hellcat's might was yet to come, and as the sound of the enemy's tanks grew louder, Bill's heart beat faster, knowing the true battle was about to begin. The storm had only just begun. The Hellcat's engine roared through the forest, its track tearing into the earth, sending the thick underbrush flying behind it like a veil of dust and dirt. Bill Barnes, gripping the controls of the tank, felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. The first explosion had been successful, a direct hit, but it wasn't enough. The German Panzers were still coming, their heavy armor advancing relentlessly, and every moment that passed, the chances of their survival shrank. "One more hit and they'll be on us, Bill," Corporal Myers said from behind, his voice tight with tension. The young man had been with Barnes for nearly a year, always calm under pressure, but there was something different in his voice now, an edge of fear, of doubt. "Stay sharp, Myers. We hit them, then we vanish." "That's the plan," Bill replied, though his own confidence was beginning to waver. The Panzers were slower, sure, but they had the advantage of firepower and sheer numbers. What good was speed if they couldn't keep it up long enough? Bill's thoughts flashed back to the briefing earlier that day. The mission was simple: strike quickly, neutralize as many tanks as possible, and then disappear into the forest before the enemy could regroup. It was the Hellcat's strength: mobility, precision, and speed. But there was always a catch. There was always the chance that the Germans, with their vast resources, would adapt faster than anyone had anticipated. As Bill's Hellcat raced deeper into the forest, a new challenge emerged. Through the thick trees ahead, he could see the hulking shapes of German Panzers, a whole battalion. They had set up a defensive line, and it was a formidable one. The Hellcat's speed had caught them off guard once, but now they were ready. Bill's heart pounded, his mind racing through possible strategies. The mission was supposed to be quick, precise, but this was escalating into something bigger. "Steady, everyone," Bill said, forcing his voice to remain calm. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for the next move. The radio crackled to life, and Sergeant Martin, the observer, spoke up, his voice tense. "Sir, we've got company. The Panzers are doubling back, trying to trap us in the trees. We're not going to outrun them if they get ahead of us." Bill's stomach tightened. He knew the risk. The Hellcat could dart in and out, but if they were cornered in the dense woods, they would be sitting ducks. "We'll take the long route through the ravine. It's narrow, but we'll be able to use the terrain to keep them from flanking us. Keep your heads down and stay sharp," Bill ordered, his voice steady but his mind churning with doubt. In the distance, German Lieutenant Hans Müller watched the advancing Hellcats from his Panzer. He had heard the reports of the fast-moving tank destroyers, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of their speed. His men had been rattled, but Müller, an experienced commander, knew that no matter how fast these Hellcats were, they would eventually slip up. He gritted his teeth as he surveyed the forest ahead. He had to keep his men calm. They had the firepower, the superior numbers. This was just another skirmish, another enemy trying to break their resolve. He had seen it all before. But then through his periscope, Müller saw the flash of movement. The Hellcat had made another quick strike, taking out one of his Panzers in a heartbeat. The blast was deafening, sending smoke and debris into the air. The Hellcat was moving again, faster than the German gunners could track. Muller's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We're not losing to these damn things," he muttered to himself, his voice low but filled with frustration. "Form a perimeter. Get ready to trap them. I want them gone." His orders were sharp, and the Panzers began to fan out, trying to catch the Hellcats in a pincers movement. But Muller wasn't certain. He had seen the speed of the Hellcat firsthand, and the realization gnawed at him. What if these tanks weren't just a nuisance? What if they could actually win this fight? Inside the Hellcat, Bill's nerves were taut as he guided his crew through the ravine. The narrow path was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it would keep the Germans from flanking them, but on the other, it limited their ability to maneuver. Every turn, every rock, every twist of the terrain could spell disaster. "Here they come," Sergeant Martin called out, his voice full of urgency. Through the thickening smoke, he could make out the shadowy figures of the German tanks closing in, their massive guns aimed in their direction. "Take the shot, Myers," Bill shouted, barely able to hear himself over the engine's roar. Corporal Myers wasted no time. With a sharp, practiced motion, he lined up the Hellcat's gun and fired. The shot struck one of the Panzers dead on, but it didn't seem to slow the Germans down. The enemy tank continued to charge forward, smoke pouring from its turret. Bill cursed under his breath. "It's not enough. They've got too many reinforcements." The trap was closing in. He could feel the pressure mounting. They had taken out a few, sure, but more were coming. There was no way they could outrun the Germans now. The narrow ravine had worked for a time, but it was also boxing them in, forcing them to slow down. If they didn't find a way out soon, they were done. The radio crackled again. "Bill, we've got a problem. The lead Hellcat's been hit. They're slowing down. They need support." Bill's mind raced. "Hold steady," he called to his crew. "We're not abandoning anyone." But deep down, Bill knew the truth. They couldn't keep this up forever. The Panzers were closing in, their numbers overwhelming. And as the gap between the Hellcats and the German tanks shrank, the decision weighed heavily on his shoulders: stay and fight, or make a desperate escape. As the first enemy shell ricocheted off their turret, the weight of the situation became clearer. The Germans were closing in. This was no longer just a mission to destroy. This was a fight for survival. In the distance, the sound of a second explosion shattered the silence of the ravine. Another Hellcat had gone down. Bill clenched his teeth, his grip tightening on the controls. The pressure was suffocating. The fear, the doubt, it was all there, festering in the back of his mind. He could hear the frantic breathing of his crew, their eyes wide with anxiety. But what choice did they have? They had to keep fighting. They couldn't give up now. "We either fight through or we die trying," Bill muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But as the German tanks advanced, the dread in his heart grew. They had been fast. They had been deadly, but they hadn't counted on the enemy adapting so quickly. They hadn't counted on being cornered. And now, as the enemy tanks loomed larger and larger, the future felt uncertain. The storm was closing in. There was no more running. The sound of grinding metal and shattering wood reverberated through the dense forest as the Hellcat raced ahead, its engine screaming, fighting against the overwhelming pressure of the encroaching German tanks. The once quiet ravine was now a battleground. Trees splintered under the weight of shells, and the air smelled of gunpowder, smoke, and the acrid stench of burning oil. Bill Barnes could feel the pounding of his heart in his ears, the frantic rhythm mirroring the chaos outside. The Hellcat had been in many battles before, but this felt different. This felt like they were fighting for their very survival. "Left side, Bill!" Sergeant Martin shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of their engine. "They're trying to box us in. We need to move now." Bill's hands gripped the turret's controls, his knuckles white with tension. He could see them, the Panzers, lining up, their heavy turrets swiveling, ready to unleash another volley. The Hellcat had been quick and deadly, but they were no longer just facing a few isolated tanks. The entire German battalion had caught up, and they were closing in from all sides. In the corner of his eye, Bill saw the flashes of more explosions. Another Hellcat had been hit. The crew's radio crackled, its static-filled voice a grim reminder of the growing danger. "Bill, we've been hit! I repeat, we've been hit! We can't move! We need assistance!" Bill's stomach twisted. He could hear the panic in the voice of Corporal Daniels, the commander of the 2nd Hellcat. The reality of their situation was sinking in. If they didn't act now, the Germans would tear them apart. "Keep firing," Bill barked, rallying his crew. "We're not leaving anyone behind." He knew the stakes. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The mission was slipping out of their control. They had been tasked with crippling the German forces, disrupting their defensive line, but now it was a fight to hold on, a fight for survival. The enemy had adapted faster than they had anticipated, and now Bill was left to make a choice that would define the outcome of the battle. The Hellcat swerved sharply, dodging an incoming shell, but it was clear the terrain was working against them. The ravine, once their advantage, was now a trap. The Germans were methodically closing in, their Panzers relentless. Bill's mind raced as he glanced over his shoulder. The 2nd Hellcat, now immobilized, was a sitting target. Daniels and his crew were in trouble, and every second they wasted could be their last. "Do we go back for them, Bill?" Corporal Myers asked, his voice hoarse with urgency. "We can't leave them to the Germans." Bill's heart hammered in his chest. He didn't have to think hard to know what Myers was asking. Going back for Daniels meant leaving the rest of the team vulnerable. Their position was precarious enough as it was, but leaving one of their own behind was not something Bill was willing to do. He had promised his crew he would lead them out of this, and that meant keeping them all alive. But the clock was ticking, and the enemy was closing in faster than they could react. The decision gnawed at him. Bill's thoughts flashed back to the training exercises, the countless simulations they'd run in the quiet of the barracks. The plan had been clear: strike quickly, avoid engagement when overwhelmed, and get out. But plans didn't account for the kind of pressure they were facing now. They had never prepared for the possibility of being cornered, for the crushing weight of knowing that every decision could be their last. He glanced out the viewport again. The German tanks were almost upon them, their massive forms looming just beyond the trees, their guns trained on the Hellcat. In the distance, the now static radio crackled again. Daniel's voice, desperate, echoed through the speaker. "Bill, we need you. We can't hold them off for much longer. Please help us." Bill's gut twisted. There was no time. If he stayed and fought, the entire mission would collapse. But if he left Daniels behind, he would be sealing his crew's fate. The Hellcat couldn't take another hit, and the Germans knew exactly where to strike. "Bill," Myers said softly, his voice a reminder of the weight of the decision. "We've been through a lot together. We can't just let them fall." Bill's jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the battlefield. The German tanks were closing in from all directions, their firepower overwhelming. The Hellcat had been their secret weapon, but now it was becoming their death trap. He couldn't risk the whole mission for a single crew, but the memory of Daniel's voice, the desperation in his words, stayed with Bill. His mind fought against the clock, against the crushing weight of command. What was the point of surviving if you left your own behind? The Hellcat might have been fast, but it was nothing without the men inside it. "Damn it," Bill muttered under his breath. "We're going back." He swung the Hellcat's turret around, aiming it directly at the position where Daniel's tank had been disabled. The German tanks hadn't completely surrounded them yet, and Bill knew they could still make it, but it would take everything they had. "Hang on, Myers," Bill shouted, his voice tight with resolve. "We're going in. Keep the gun ready. We're hitting them hard and fast." Myers nodded, his face set with determination. "Aye, sir. We're not leaving anyone behind." Bill slammed the throttle forward, and the Hellcat surged, its powerful engine thrumming beneath them. Every bump in the road, every twist in the terrain seemed to push them closer to the line between success and failure. The German tanks, now fully aware of their movements, opened fire. Shells whistled past them, sending trees splintering into the air. Another explosion rocked the Hellcat, and Bill felt the tank shudder beneath him. "Myers, return fire. Aim for that Panzer on the right," he shouted, his mind calculating the angle. The pressure was suffocating. Their path was being blocked on all sides. A shot rang out from the Hellcat's gun, and a German tank exploded, its turret launching into the air in a violent arc. But the battle was far from over. The Germans, now fully aware of their intentions, began to close in, their guns firing in a deadly rhythm. Bill could feel the heat from the shells as they screamed past. "We've got to move now," Myers yelled, his voice strained with attention. Bill's eyes narrowed as he steered the Hellcat toward Daniel's position. They were within range, but the German fire was intensifying. The Hellcat lurched forward again, but another explosion sent a wave of heat crashing into their armored frame. It was close, too close. They couldn't take much more of this. As the Hellcat's engine screamed for more speed, Bill could see the second Hellcat in the distance, its crew still alive but pinned down. They had a chance, but it was slipping away with every second. The decision had been made. They were going in, even if it meant their lives. The Hellcat, with all its speed, was no longer just a tool for victory. It was a symbol of the courage they had left. It was now or never. And as the German tanks closed in, Bill knew the price of survival had just become more expensive than he had ever imagined. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning oil and smoke, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the battle. Bill Barnes's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the controls of the Hellcat. The rumbling of the engine had become a constant, a low growl that mixed with the chaos of explosions, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the terrifying sound of metal meeting metal. Every second was a desperate gamble. The Hellcat had been forced into a retreat, yet the path they were following led them right into the heart of the German assault. The enemy was closing in from every angle, and there was no way out. The second Hellcat, now just a few hundred yards away, was crippled, its crew trapped, pinned down by relentless German fire. Bill had made the decision. They would go in and rescue them, no matter the cost. "Bill!" Myers' voice broke through the cacophony, a sound of fear and urgency. "We can't hold out much longer. The Germans are closing in too fast." The words hung in the air like an unbearable weight. They had already lost so much. The mission that had started with such promise was now spiraling into something far darker. The Hellcats had been the swift and deadly force they'd counted on, but now they were being hunted by their own tactics. Bill's eyes locked onto the wrecked Hellcat ahead, its turret at an awkward angle, smoke billowing from the engine compartment. Daniel's crew had been through hell, and now it was Bill's turn to face the grim reality. The fate of the second Hellcat was intertwined with his own. If he didn't act now, they would all die. There was no time for second guesses, no room for hesitation. "Hold tight, everyone," Bill barked, his voice unwavering. "We're not leaving anyone behind. We're going in. Now!" He slammed the throttle forward, feeling the Hellcat surge ahead, its engine roaring in response. The sound of the Germans' artillery fire increased, deafening in its intensity, but the Hellcat's agility remained its only advantage. Bill's crew braced themselves as they plowed through the underbrush, tearing past trees and debris, weaving through the terrain like a predator closing in on its prey. Ahead, the enemy tanks were closing in, their hulking forms moving steadily toward Daniel's position. The Panzers had them surrounded, and Bill could see the telltale plumes of smoke rising from the disabled Hellcat. This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. As they approached, a massive explosion rocked the ground, sending a shock wave through the air. Bill's eyes snapped to the Hellcat's turret, where he could barely make out the figures of Daniels and his crew, ducking and covering as the explosions rained down around them. But the Germans were now focused on the threat that was Bill's Hellcat, a deadly, fast-moving tank that they hadn't yet figured out how to stop. "Ready the gun," Bill shouted. "Take out that lead Panzer." The Hellcat's turret swung into position, and Myers fired a shot, the blast cutting through the air. The German tank ahead erupted in a cloud of flames, its turret spinning violently before it collapsed into a smoking ruin. It was a direct hit, but there was no time to celebrate. Another wave of German tanks was already moving in, their cannons roaring as they fired. "We've got to get in there, Bill. They don't have much time," Myers shouted, his voice urgent, filled with fear. Bill's heart raced. The decision was weighing heavily on him. They could continue to fight, keep retreating, try to escape, but he had made a promise to Daniels, to his crew, that they would make it out together. And now Bill knew that the only way to keep that promise was to face the Germans head-on, to fight their way through. "Hold your fire, Myers," Bill commanded, his voice low and calm. "We're going straight for Daniels. If we can get close enough, we'll take them out from within." The Hellcat veered sharply, cutting through the trees and debris like a blade. The German tanks were relentless, but they weren't quick enough to predict the Hellcat's next move. With a loud thud, they plowed into the clearing where Daniel's Hellcat lay. The crew inside was huddled low, their guns trained on the advancing Germans. They hadn't given up, but they were running out of time. "Daniels, get ready!" Bill yelled as they slid to a stop just behind the wreckage. "We're getting you out of here!" But just as they were about to open fire, the ground beneath them shook with a terrifying force. An explosion erupted from the right, a direct hit from a German Panzer. The Hellcat rocked violently, throwing everyone inside against their restraints. "Bill!" Myers screamed. "We're taking too much fire. We need to move." Bill's hands trembled for just a moment. They had been too focused on the rescue, too consumed with the idea of saving Daniels. The enemy was closing in fast, and the Hellcat was no longer in a position to escape. Bill looked at his crew, each one of them tense with fear, but resolute. He knew what had to be done. The Germans were relentless, and even with their superior speed, the Hellcat couldn't outrun them forever. His mind flashed to their training, to the countless hours they'd spent preparing for this moment. He knew there was one final choice to be made. The Hellcat had been built for speed, for precision, but now it had become their shield, their weapon, and their lifeline. It was their final stand. "Hold on, everyone!" Bill shouted, his voice rising above the roar of the enemy fire. "This is it! We make our move now, or we'll be trapped for good." With a deafening roar, Bill slammed the throttle forward. The Hellcat lunged forward into the line of fire, charging directly at the German tanks in a bold, last-ditch attempt to break through the encirclement. The ground shook under the relentless barrage, but Bill's resolve didn't waver. With the sound of metal screaming against metal, the Hellcat crashed into the first German tank, knocking it off course. The explosion from the impact sent a shockwave through the air, and Bill felt the heat as it roared past them. The Hellcat was battered, the hull scarred by the incoming fire, but it held its ground. The seconds stretched out into eternity. The German tanks were now in full retreat, their lines disrupted by the surprise attack. Bill had forced the Germans to falter, but the cost was high. The Hellcat's engine sputtered, and Bill could feel the vibrations of the dying machine beneath him. "Bill, we've got to get out! It's over!" Myers shouted, his voice choked with urgency. Bill's hand hovered over the controls, the decision before him stark and final. He could try to escape, but the damage was too severe. The Hellcat was already on its last legs. They couldn't outrun the Germans now. "Cover the rear," Bill said, his voice filled with finality. "I'm going back for Daniels." With the last of his strength, Bill shifted the Hellcat into reverse, turning the tank toward the wrecked Hellcat. There was no more time for hesitation. His crew could still make it out. He could still make it out. But in that moment, as Bill Barnes looked back at his crew, the men he had fought alongside for so long, he knew one thing for certain: their sacrifice would not be in vain. The Hellcat's engine sputtered to a stop, and in the distant roar of the retreating enemy, Bill made one last, selfless choice. It was a moment of desperation, of bravery, and of the heart-wrenching truth that sometimes survival meant letting go. The Germans were closing in, and the final price for survival would soon be paid. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in the wake of the battle. Bill Barnes sat alone in the Hellcat's turret, his hands still gripping the controls, though the engine had long since fallen silent. The once thriving forest, full of life and sound, was now a scarred battleground. Trees lay uprooted, their once proud trunks splintered by the force of explosions. The ground was littered with debris, the remnants of the fierce conflict that had unfolded only moments before. Bill didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the distant horizon, but his mind was somewhere far deeper, somewhere darker. The feeling of weightlessness, the sense that everything had shifted, was still with him. He could still hear the echoes of the explosions, the cries of his crew, the desperate voice of Daniels over the radio. But now it was all just noise, hollow, meaningless. His chest tightened as he slowly exhaled, trying to shake off the suffocating feeling of guilt that had settled over him. They had fought bravely, done everything they could to survive. But in the end, what had they really accomplished? They had won the battle, sure, but at what cost? The second Hellcat had been lost, and though they'd rescued Daniel's crew, many of them were wounded, some of them too badly to make it back. The air was still thick with the stench of burning fuel, and the distant whine of artillery fire felt like a distant echo from another world. Bill closed his eyes. The faces of his crew flashed in his mind. Myers, Martin, Daniels. They had all trusted him to get them out of this. But had he done enough? Could he have done more? The questions gnawed at him, relentless. "Sir," a voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see Sergeant Martin standing beside him, his face grim but resolute. "We're ready to move out, Bill. The rest of the crew's ready too. We've got to get out of here before the Germans regroup." Bill nodded slowly, his body feeling heavier with each passing moment. "Yeah, I know. Let's go." They had survived, but the victory felt hollow. They had all been through hell together, and now they were left with the aftermath. The wreckage of their Hellcat, the lost comrades, and the haunting memory of the desperate fight for survival. As Bill climbed out of the turret and stepped onto the battered ground, he felt the weight of the battle's toll pressing down on him. His eyes scanned the landscape around him. The once green forest now reduced to a graveyard of war. There was no triumph in this, no glory, just the aftermath of a battle fought with everything they had, and the bitter truth that sometimes survival wasn't enough. Bill's journey back was long and quiet. The Hellcat, once a symbol of speed and power, was now a silent, broken shell of its former self. The remaining crew trudged through the forest, their faces tired, their eyes haunted. The Germans had been pushed back for now, but it was clear that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The struggle wasn't over, but Bill's heart wasn't in it anymore. The world around him felt distant, as though he were trapped in a fog of exhaustion and grief. His body ached with every step, but it was the weight in his chest that felt the heaviest. What was it all for? The sacrifice of his crew, the loss of comrades. All of it felt meaningless now. They had fought for survival, for the mission, but who would remember their names? Who would remember the choices they had made? They had all fought together, but in the end, who had truly won? Back at the Allied base, as they were greeted by officers and medical personnel, Bill couldn't bring himself to feel relief. His mind was still on the battlefield, still with the men they had lost. The medals, the praise, none of it mattered. The faces of those who had died, those who had been left behind, would haunt him forever. The soldiers gathered around him, some of them laughing, others speaking softly in hushed tones. But Bill couldn't bring himself to join in. His eyes locked onto the horizon again, as though the answer to his turmoil was out there, somewhere far beyond the base camp. But the answer wasn't out there. It never had been. He had been so focused on getting them out alive, on completing the mission, that he hadn't stopped to consider the true cost of survival. Now, as the dust settled and the weight of the aftermath grew heavier, he understood the price they had paid. It was a lesson learned in the most brutal way possible. Later that evening, Bill sat in his tent, staring at the night sky. The sound of the camp was muffled, the chatter of soldiers distant. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt lost. The war had taught him many things, but the hardest lesson was this: survival often came at the cost of everything else. His crew had fought with everything they had, but at what cost? Would anyone remember them? Would anyone remember their sacrifice? Or would they simply be another footnote in the vast history of war? The silence was broken by a soft knock on the door of his tent. Bill didn't need to look up to know who it was. He knew the voice, the steady footsteps. "Mind if I join you, Bill?" It was Myers. Bill nodded without speaking, and the young corporal stepped inside, pulling up a seat across from him. For a long while they sat in silence, the weight of the day's events settling between them. Finally Myers spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "You did everything you could, sir. We all did." Bill didn't reply immediately. He just stared out into the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. "Sometimes it's not enough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't bring them all home, Myers, and I'll never forget that." Myers didn't argue. He knew that Bill was carrying the weight of the decisions they had all made. We all have to live with the choices we make, sir, but we can't forget the ones we saved. Daniels and his crew, they're alive because of what we did. Bill's eyes closed for a moment, and he nodded. Yeah, I know, but it doesn't make it any easier. They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Myers stood up. I'll leave you to your thoughts, sir, but don't carry this alone. We're all in this together. As Myers left the tent, Bill sat back in his chair, his mind wandering. There was no glory in this war, no easy answers. He had learned that the hard way. Survival wasn't about fighting for fame or recognition. It was about fighting for those you cared about, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. He thought of the letter he had read once, written by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in 1943 after the Battle of Midway. In it, he spoke of the sacrifice of those who fought, the soldiers who gave their lives for the greater good. But what struck Bill the most was one line that had stayed with him ever since. In the end, it's not about the victory or the defeat. It's about how we choose to carry the weight of those who came before us. Bill Barnes would carry that weight for the rest of his life.